Welcome to yet another episode of In Conversation with Tibettv. For this episode, we have Aastha Binzani, a PhD candidate at the Center for East Asia Studies, China Division at Jawaharlal Nehru University. Aastha has written and presented several papers on China and China-India policy. She's currently here at the 7th Young Indian Scholars Conference on Tibetan Studies to present her paper titled Securitization and Silence, Tibetan Resistance under India's Geopolitical Constraints. Welcome to the program, Aastha.
Thank you for having me.
So, Aastha, this morning at the conference, you spoke on historical relationship between India and China, and then the shift in their foreign policy back and forth, right? So you spoke of the 1954 Panchsheel Agreement, which is supposed to be an agreement of peaceful coexistence. And then a few years later, in 1962, there was a war between China and India, and the relationship turned bitter to say for several decades. And then with Rajiv Gandhi's visit to China in 1988, the relationship mended a little bit. So my question is, how does this fluctuating tie between India and China affect the Tibetan population in general, and especially the Tibetans living in India? Where do you think the relationship between the Indian government and the Central Tibetan Administration stand today?
Yeah, so definitely it had implications for the Tibetan population in India because, after the Panchsheel agreement, that whole period, even when the Tibetans were welcomed and, they talked about the asylum which was provided later, and so when the relationships were sort of improving during Panchsheel, that was the first time India recognized Chinese sovereignty over Tibet, right? After independence, they have been pushing for some kind of token suzerainty, and they had been pushing for Tibetan autonomy, which was the whole colonial legacy, continuation of the colonial legacy. And then after the war, like when the relations went through like a decades of freeze, like you said, then we saw like more of like establishment of the CTA institution building. Then the Dalai Lama proclaimed the constitution. So all of these things which were before not allowed, or might have led to some kind of like hesitancy on part of the Indian government. You see, during that period, India started also backing UNGA resolution in 1965. I talked about it earlier, that pushing for Tibetan human rights of the Tibetans, right? So it definitely has this fluctuating relations between the two countries. Definitely have implications for Tibetans. So now I think we are in a very tricky situation because we had Galwan, but we also now see India and China trying to have some kind of reset because of the larger geopolitics, where India is having problems with the US, China is having problems with the US, and there is a lot of common ground. So, and also they, of course, because these are two big powers who are trying to coexist, right? And they want to give primacy to relations with each other. Definitely, it creates some trouble for the Tibetans living in India, right? Because when they see the two powers getting closer together, it creates some confusion or some kind of anxiety in the Tibetan, say the government in exile, or there are questions as to how India is going to deal with the Tibetan population here back home.
Right. So continuing on your presentation, you also spoke on the form of silencing, right? In context to Tibetans in exile, you said silencing is systematic and outcome of political diplomacy. So talking about the diplomatic sensitivity that Tibetans in India carry, India's logic of preemption is evident, especially during the visits of Chinese leaders in India, and also during when Tibetans observe these festivities and occasions, right? So could you tell us your view on the outcome of these preemptive compliances, especially on Tibetans?
There are two types of things which are happening. There are two types of silencing which this results in. One is the material silencing, where people are, detained, or they are removed from the protest sites, told not to demonstrate. The other is the symbolic silencing, where flags are removed, and this leads to a kind of erasure. And then this silencing also is seen in other, larger arenas, where you have like, so on one hand you have a government in exile, but then you do not include them in any kind of diplomatic conversations, right? So I think that's like the broader silencing which is taking place apart from the preemptive silencing that we talked about.
So with a lot of these border standoffs between India and China, and now with the Medok hydroelectric project that the China is pushing forward, and with the implications that could have on India, especially the Arunachal Pradesh area, do you think it's time for India to take a bolder stand on Tibet?
Yeah, but I think it's also important for India to be a little careful because you do not want to, like you do not want to provoke the Chinese at the same time, right? Because we've seen a lot of border tensions. Everybody wants peace on the borders, but at the same time, India also needs to take care that they do not, in just to maintain their relations with the Chinese or not to annoy the Chinese or provoke them too much, that they do not, give up on the Tibetans, right? So there need to find some kind of balance between these two things.
Right. So I read one of your articles in Deccan Herald on China's BDS, that is the
Yeah.
Beidou navigation satellite system, right? And the security threats from the possible security threats from that. In 2018, Pakistan became the first foreign countries to have access to a military-grade BDS system, and then now China is trying to push that further to a lot of India's neighboring countries like Bangladesh and then Nepal and then Sri Lanka, right? So with that becoming an information leverage point for China, do you think how big of a national security threat is that for India?
I think it's a grave threat because I mean, how things are going, it gives China all the information about you, but it also lets your neighbors like Pakistan engage in proxy war.
Right.
It also aids because a lot of, so the main point that article was trying to make was all of these terrorists, the Pakistani backed terrorists who were shot, they have been, and this has been a trend which has been seen over like a few years now. And then the intelligence agencies have been talking about how they were carrying peto linked devices on them, which was very difficult for the Indian agencies, like it could evade surveillance easily. So that is one very, I think, very serious concern. Yeah, and also like in terms of other neighbors who are trying to, definitely it will give India like sorry, China greater information in the neighborhood, and also like in terms of growing relations, and um, it will also sort of reduce Indian influence in the neighborhood.
So what do you think? What do you suggest the Indian government to do with that?
They should. So we have our own NAVIC system, but it's lagging considerably behind the Chinese system. So one is push for NAVIC adoption in the neighborhood, try to counter peto expansion, and the other would be we have to work on our own capabilities, right? In terms of surveillance, in terms of better, because NAVIC is not very well developed. So we should also at least we should be ambitious enough to work on something like achieving something which is nearly as capable as peto.
Right.
Right.
Right. So, what do you think? China's integrating AI with these with their BDS system, right? So, what do you think that means in terms of military and surveillance capabilities? Could that lead to China taking the title of hegemony in some time?
So I think that's like a project in progress, right? So they are talking about a smarter peto where they are planning to integrate AI. So one has to wait and watch, but definitely it is going to have consequences for military and security. So, but one has to wait and watch how that unfolds. Yeah.
Right. And then in the meantime, work on developing your own.
Own
Right.
capabilities, yeah, definitely.
So thank you so much, Asta, for agreeing to this interview and speaking to Tibet TV.
Thank you for giving me this opportunity to talk to you. It was really nice.
Um, so that is all for this episode of In Conversation with Tibet TV. I will see you in the next one.